Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive with us. Today, we're going to be tackling something pretty major in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and that is this proposed 30-day ceasefire coming from the U.S. It seems like it could be a huge turning point.
Yeah, especially with with the timing of it all, right? We've had this period of really intense fighting, negotiations have kind of been stalled, and then boom, suddenly there's this ceasefire proposal.
Exactly. It makes you wonder if this is a genuine step towards peace or if there's, maybe a hidden agenda or some other factors at play here.
Right.
So to help us break this all down, we've got two really interesting sources to work with today. We've got a BBC News article
Okay.
that goes into detail about the recent U.S.-Ukraine talks in Saudi Arabia, which is where this whole ceasefire idea got started. And we've also got an analysis of the situation by Professor Aaron Alves, who dives into the potential motivations and strategies, from both sides.
Yeah, that's a great combination. Having that factual base from the BBC and then kind of that deeper analysis from Professor Alves should give us a lot to work with.
For sure. So let's start with the basics, like what actually happened. The BBC article explains how U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who I think a lot of people will remember from, his time in the Senate, how he presented this 30-day ceasefire to Russia. And this all happened during those talks in Saudi Arabia.
Right.
And it seems like, at least from what the BBC is saying, Ukraine's response has been cautious, but, kind of hopeful.
Yeah.
Zelensky called the proposal positive.
Yeah.
But he also made it really clear that Russia needs to prove they're actually serious about stopping the war.
It's a show me, don't tell me kind of situation at this point.
Totally. After everything that's happened, Ukraine has every right to be a little skeptical.
Absolutely, yeah. And the BBC article also points out that these talks, these U.S.-Ukraine talks, were significant for another reason. This was their first official meeting since that pretty public disagreement between Zelensky and former U.S. President Donald Trump.
Right.
And it seems like they've, managed to move past that incident and come together to craft this joint statement about the ceasefire.
Yeah. And speaking of Trump, this BBC article mentions that he's now planning to talk to Putin, and he's also pushing for some kind of critical minerals deal with Ukraine.
Oh, interesting.
Can you just remind us what those minerals actually are and why there's such a big deal in all of this?
Yeah, for sure. It's an interesting side plot, for sure. These critical minerals, we're talking about things like lithium, cobalt. Those are really essential materials for making batteries for all kinds of high-tech stuff.
Right.
And Ukraine, they happen to have pretty significant deposits of these minerals.
Oh, okay.
So a deal like this could be a big win financially for both Ukraine and the U.S. But it also has some serious geopolitical implications. Like, it could potentially reduce Russia's influence in the region.
I see.
So, this whole minerals thing just adds another layer of complexity to an already very, very tangled situation.
That's a lot to unpack, for sure.
Yeah.
And it just goes to show how high the stakes are for everyone involved here.
Yeah.
But let's get back to this ceasefire itself. The BBC article says that as of right now, Russia hasn't officially responded to the U.S. proposal. However, the spokeswoman for their foreign ministry didn't rule out talks with U.S. representatives in the coming days. So the door isn't completely closed, at least not yet.
Okay, that's an important detail to note. It suggests that Russia's at least open to considering the proposal, even if they're not, fully committing to anything yet. And this is where Professor Alves' analysis comes in and starts to get really interesting. He's arguing that the U.S. proposal might not be as straightforward as just a gesture of peace. There might be more to it.
Right, he uses the term recalibrate, right, saying that the U.S. needs to recalibrate its approach to this whole war. What does he actually mean by that?
So Professor Alves suggests that a major factor, and this is especially relevant because it's an election year in the U.S., is that they really, really want to avoid a total Ukrainian military defeat. I mean, you've been following this conflict closely, so you know how much the U.S. is invested in supporting Ukraine.
Right.
Professor Alves is saying that if Ukraine were to completely collapse, it would be a huge blow to U.S. credibility globally. Especially with an election coming up, that's not something they want to see happen.
That makes sense. There's got to be a ton of pressure on the U.S. to show that all this support for Ukraine is actually producing results. So a ceasefire, even a temporary one, could be a way for them to buy some time, prevent a really bad outcome politically.
Exactly, yeah. And beyond the political calculations, Professor Alves also brings up this really interesting point about how public support for the war and even support within the U.S. government is starting to waver. So it's not just about what the U.S. wants to do, but what they can realistically keep doing long term.
So this ceasefire, this could give them a little bit of breathing room, a chance to figure out a new approach, and maybe even drum up more support for staying involved.
No, that's one way to look at it, yeah. But Professor Alves also makes this really interesting point about how this whole recalibration thing could affect the U.S. relationship with their allies in Europe. Did you notice in the BBC article how European nations were completely left out of those talks in Jeddah?
Yeah, that really stood out to me. It seems strange to exclude key players like France and Germany from something this important.
Yeah, it definitely raises some questions about possible tensions within NATO. Professor Alves suggests that this could be a sign that the U.S. is shifting towards a more unilateral approach, taking charge of these negotiations without fully consulting their allies.
But isn't that kind of risky? If the U.S. pushes their allies away, wouldn't that weaken their position against Russia overall?
It's a gamble for sure, but it could be a strategic move on their part. Professor Alves points out that Europe, geographically, they've got a lot more at stake in this conflict than the U.S. does. So maybe the U.S. is calculating they have to act more decisively, even if it ruffles some feathers.
And there's also that line in the BBC article where the U.S.-Ukraine joint statement says that Kyiv reiterated that Europe should be involved in any peace process. It almost sounds like they're kind of throwing shade at the U.S.
It does have that undertone, doesn't it? It really highlights how tricky this balancing act is for the U.S. On the one hand, they want to show strong support for Ukraine and be the leader in resolving this conflict.
Right.
But at the same time, they need to keep NATO together and not alienate their European partners.
It's a real high-wire act. If they make the wrong move, it could have huge consequences. So we've talked a lot about what the U.S. might be hoping to achieve with this ceasefire. But what about Russia? How are they likely to respond to all of this?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it? Trying to figure out what Putin's thinking. But Professor Alves, he actually offers some really interesting insights about this, outlining different scenarios based on how Russia might respond.
Okay.
It's fascinating, really. He goes through all the potential benefits and drawbacks from Russia's perspective. For example, if they accept the ceasefire, it would give them the opportunity to really solidify their control over those territories they've already captured. Basically, it lets them kind of hit pause while they're ahead.
Right, so it's like they get to catch their breath a little bit.
Yeah.
They can reinforce their positions, maybe even start integrating those areas more firmly into Russia, all without risking further losses.
Exactly. And there's also this diplomatic advantage that comes with accepting the ceasefire. It lets Russia present themselves to the rest of the world as, the reasonable ones, the ones who are open to peace talks.
Right.
Which, can be a really powerful image, especially if the West is seen as the side that's pushing for the conflict to continue.
It's all about how things look, isn't it?
Absolutely. Perception is everything in these kinds of situations.
They can appear to be open to diplomacy while strategically capitalizing on what they've already gained.
Precisely. And we can't forget about the economic side of things either. Accepting the ceasefire could potentially ease some of the sanctions pressure that's been hitting Russia's economy pretty hard.
Yeah.
Even a temporary break from that economic pressure could be very appealing.
So it sounds like a ceasefire could offer some real advantages for Russia. But Professor Alves also explains why they might choose to just reject the whole idea.
Right. There are definitely reasons why they might say no. One of the big ones is this belief that they still have the upper hand militarily. They might think that continuing the offensive is their best chance of achieving whatever their ultimate goals are.
So they're thinking, why settle for a ceasefire that could limit their gains when they believe they have a shot at winning the whole thing?
That's exactly it. And they might also be betting on this idea that Western support for Ukraine is going to fade over time. Professor Alves suggests that Russia might be thinking, if we can just hold out long enough, the West is going to lose interest, and then we'll be able to dictate the terms.
That's a pretty risky strategy, though, isn't it? There's no guarantee that Western resolve is actually going to crumble. And in the meantime, everybody involved is paying a huge price, both in terms of human life and the economic costs.
Absolutely. It's a very high-stakes gamble. And Professor Alves goes even deeper, suggesting that if Russia did agree to this ceasefire, they'd want to make absolutely sure that Ukraine couldn't use that time to, regroup and strengthen their forces. It wouldn't be a true period of rebuilding and healing. It'd be more like this strategic pause where everyone's still on edge, just waiting for the next move.
It really highlights how fragile this whole thing is. Even if they both agreed to stop fighting, would it actually lead to a real, lasting peace?
That's the ultimate question, isn't it? We've spent this deep dive talking about potential motivations, strategic considerations, the risks and the rewards for both sides. But at the end of the day, it all comes down to whether there's enough political will, enough trust, and enough common ground between them to actually build a peace that lasts.
We've talked about the U.S. perspective. We've talked about Russia. But what about Ukraine? They're the ones who are literally caught in the middle of all of this. What does the BBC article say about their position?
Well, according to the article, Zelensky seems open to the idea of a ceasefire, but he's made it very clear that he expects Russia to demonstrate their sincerity. They're not just going to take Russia at their word. They want to see concrete actions that prove Russia's committed to actually ending this war.
Which makes sense. I mean, Ukraine's the one that's bearing the brunt of the fighting. They have the most to lose if this ceasefire fails. So, of course, they're going to be cautious and wary of, any potential traps or false promises.
Absolutely. And it's important to remember that Ukraine has agency in all of this. They're not just a pawn in some bigger game between the U.S. and Russia. They have their own interests, their own red lines, and they're going to be assertive in protecting those.
So even if the U.S. and Russia do come to some agreement on a ceasefire, there's no guarantee that it'll actually lead to a true, lasting peace. There are still so many fundamental issues that need to be resolved, like those territorial disputes, security guarantees, political differences, not to mention this deep mistrust that exists between all the parties involved.
You're right. A ceasefire is just a pause in the fighting. It's not a solution in and of itself. And this whole situation is so much more complex than just this one ceasefire proposal. There are all these layers of strategy, competing interests, historical baggage. It's a fascinating, albeit very serious, case study in geopolitics.
Professor Alves mentioned something in his analysis that I wanted to circle back to. The critical minerals deal that Trump is pushing. The BBC article goes into some detail about that, highlighting his intention to talk to Putin about it and how it could affect Ukraine.
Yeah, Trump's involvement definitely adds another layer of unpredictability to this whole situation. His personal relationships, his business interests, they could all have an impact on how things unfold. It's something we can't ignore.
It's like throwing a wild card into an already incredibly chaotic situation. You just don't know what's going to happen next. And speaking of unpredictable, the BBC article also mentions those drone attacks that happened in Moscow right before the talks in Jeddah.
Oh, right. Those attacks definitely raised the tension level, didn't they?
Yeah.
Russia blamed Ukraine for those attacks, claiming that it shows they're not serious about diplomacy. But it's also possible that those attacks were, a deliberate attempt by Russia to sabotage the talks or create an excuse for escalating the conflict further.
It's really hard to know for sure who is behind those attacks or what their true intentions were. But it definitely adds more uncertainty and mistrust into an already very delicate situation.
Yeah, it does. And this actually connects to something that both Professor Alves and the BBC article touch on. The growing sense of weariness within the West about continuing to fund this war.
You mean there's a feeling that the initial wave of support for Ukraine might be fading as the conflict drags on and the economic costs continue to rise?
Exactly. And you can be sure that Russia's paying attention to this shift. They may be hoping that by prolonging this conflict, they can eventually erode Western support and force Ukraine to make concessions.
So it seems like everyone's playing this high-stakes game of chicken, waiting to see who backs down first.
That's a good way to put it. And the stakes are incredibly high. The outcome of this conflict could have a huge impact on the global balance of power, on the future of Europe. It's really hard to overstate the significance of all this.
Professor Alves really gets into the weeds when it comes to analyzing Russia's thought process about accepting or rejecting this ceasefire.
He does, yeah.
Can we break that down a little more? I think it would be helpful to understand their potential reasoning.
Absolutely. He outlines some really compelling arguments for why they might choose either path, and it all boils down to how they weigh the risks and the rewards.
Okay, let's start with the potential reasons for accepting the ceasefire. What are some of the things that Professor Alves highlights there?
One of the biggest advantages for Russia, as Professor Alves points out, is that accepting the ceasefire would give them a chance to solidify their control over those territories they've already occupied. It's like they get to hit pause right when they're ahead.
Right, like taking a timeout when you've got a good lead in the game. They can catch their breath, regroup, maybe even start to integrate those areas more firmly into Russia, all without the risk of further losses.
Exactly. And on top of that, there's a huge diplomatic advantage for them. Accepting the ceasefire lets Russia present themselves on the world stage as, the reasonable ones, the peacemakers.
Right, the ones who are willing to negotiate.
Yeah, exactly. And that image can be really powerful, especially if the West is seen as the side that wants to keep fighting.
It's all about perception, right? looking like you're willing to work towards peace, while at the same time making sure you hold on to the gains you've already made.
Exactly. And we can't forget about the economic benefits either. Accepting the ceasefire could potentially lead to some easing of those sanctions that have been really hurting Russia's economy.
Yeah, even a temporary break from that economic pressure would be a big win for them.
Absolutely.
So there are some pretty strong reasons for Russia to say yes to this ceasefire. But Professor Alves also makes a pretty compelling case for why they might choose to reject it.
He does, and one of the main reasons he points to is this belief that Russia might still feel like they have the upper hand militarily. They might think that their best chance of achieving their ultimate goals is to just keep pushing forward with the offensive.
So they might be thinking, why settle for a ceasefire that could limit their gains when they think they can win the whole thing outright?
That's a very real possibility. And there's also this idea that they might be playing a longer game, hoping that the West will eventually get tired of supporting Ukraine and will back down.
Professor Alves even suggests that Russia might be thinking, if we just wait it out, eventually the West will lose interest, the pressure will ease up, and then we'll be in a much stronger position to dictate the terms.
Right. And it's a risky strategy, no doubt about it. There's no guarantee that Western support is actually going to fade.
Right.
But it's a gamble they might be willing to take. And in the meantime, everyone involved is paying a heavy price, both in terms of lives lost and, the economic fallout of all of this.
It really underscores just how complicated this whole situation is, and there are no easy answers. Professor Alves even goes so far as to suggest that even if Russia did agree to a ceasefire, they would probably try to prevent Ukraine from using that time to regroup and strengthen their forces. It wouldn't be a genuine period of, rebuilding and healing. It would be more like a strategic pause where everyone's still on edge, waiting to see what happens next.
Yeah, that's a really important point. It speaks to just how fragile any kind of ceasefire would be in a conflict like this, one that's so complex and so deeply rooted. It raises the question, even if both sides agree to stop fighting, would it actually be a step towards a real, lasting peace?
And that's a huge question. I mean, we've spent this whole deep dive looking at the possible motivations behind this ceasefire proposal, the potential benefits and risks for everyone involved, the bigger geopolitical picture. It's been fascinating to see how the factual reporting from the BBC combined with Professor Alves' analysis has given us a much deeper understanding of what's going on here.
Absolutely. And I think it's crucial to always keep in mind the human cost of this conflict. Every single day that this fighting goes on, lives are being lost, families are being torn apart, and the future of Ukraine hangs in the balance. It's easy to get lost in all this strategic and political analysis, but we can't forget about the real people who are suffering because of this war.
You're absolutely right. As we wrap up this deep dive, we're left with a lot more questions than answers. But I think that's okay. In fact, it's probably a good thing because it reminds us that this conflict is far from over, and there's still so much we need to learn and understand about what's happening.
And this deep dive has given you a great starting point. You now have a much deeper understanding of the intricacies of this situation, all the different factors at play. As you continue to follow this story, keep in mind all the things we've discussed. The strategic calculations, the political pressures, the economic fallout, and of course, the human cost of this war.
And maybe the most important question to keep asking ourselves is this. What does this ceasefire proposal really tell us about the long-term goals of both the U.S. and Russia? And what kind of compromises might Ukraine ultimately have to make if they want to achieve peace?
Those are tough questions, and there are no easy answers. But by engaging in these deep dives, by staying informed, by thinking critically about the information we encounter, we can all contribute to a more nuanced and informed understanding of this incredibly important issue.
That's a great point. Thank you so much for joining us for another deep dive. And as always, the conversation doesn't end here. Keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep seeking a deeper understanding of the world around us.